Thank you for your time. I want to throw it out to R3 and thank them for putting together, obviously, a lot of energy moving forward. Dev Day was fantastic. My presentation is going to go a bit back in the past for what we were doing before Corda, and we're going to talk about what our first transactions in February meant for us as a company and for a partnership, and then we're going to do a little bit of the future. Happy to be on the marketplace. You heard a lot about that yesterday and today, so we're one of the companies participating in the marketplace, and so you'll see us on under the resources, natural resources component. So check out R3 Marketplace, a lot of good people there. We have a history at GuildOne of delivering high technology, mostly built around Java, and of course Java as a programming language has its roots in Calgary, where we're from. We're from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So blockchain solutions, of course, is a relatively new entry, but we've been doing enterprise software. We've got a lot of models and algorithms, and we've been doing expertise and services. We've been focused on asset optimization, this concept that you can get to revenue completeness in a contract. We work very well and for a long time with the royalty aggregates. So these are companies that have aggregated a lot of royalty interests. We happen to work with some of the biggest ones in the world. Of course, we work on contracts, do a lot of work on facilities, and all of that sets us up for good compliance, but it also sets us up with a really interesting narrative for how Corda helps us and how DLT and smart contracts can help us ameliorate some of the pain we see. So we've worked with about 90 oil and gas companies and regulators, and the interesting thing there is we see the same sorts of disputes forming amongst the counterparties, and that's, of course, different representations of the truth. So this convergence, it's not all about DLT, but I think there was a really good presentation in the keynote about how DLT and blockchain can be in the middle of this convergence and how it can be sort of the blood, how we move things from system to system and how we get to systems of truth and sources of truth. So we've been working with DLT, we've been working with geospatial. In oil and gas, of course, it's very important to know the surface rights and know the subsurface or 3D and mineral entitlements. And we do a lot of that work to ensure that our companies are getting the full execution or the full completeness of their contracts. A lot of data automation involved. If there's anything true of oil and gas, it's that we have a lot of data. We have data about surface, we have data about subsurface, we have data about production, the extraction of these resources, and the compliance and regulatory events drives a lot of data on the backplane, a lot of different systems. There's one of our clients that has 1,100 systems on their supported apps list. So you can imagine there's a fragmentation, a breaking. Call that the fragmented mirror, the fragmented enterprise, where the line of business system stores different versions of the truth. That coupled with the counterparties having their own versions, and you get into dispute. So of course, machine learning against all of that data is also emerging as a very important vector of research and now implementation and application space. So just a bit about the market, and particularly our piece of it, which is the royalties piece. The daily demand for oil and gas right now is about 100 million barrels a day. And the revenue on that is about $7.8 billion a day. And the interesting thing about that is that equates, and this is a conservative estimate of about a 5% override on a royalty size, but that equates to about $393 million of transacting royalties a day. So that leads us to an annualized at a 5% lift on that, and then a 1% fee, which is what we're looking to transact into the royalty space. That entire market is about a $72 million market a day. Now, interestingly, those sound like really big numbers, but what's interesting with the industry right now is the retraction on commodity prices, and some of that has driven a whole new operating model. And we do have some companies that are doing quite well in this new operating model, but all of them are looking for a new way to reduce their costs because profitability has been shredded over the last 3 or 4 years. So interestingly comes the problem. Now I've highlighted IS for a reason because the information systems inside of these large environments have actually been part of the problem. And that is that we have layered Band-Aid solutions on in each of the silos. So in each of the companies, we're building a version of the truth. And of course, that version of the truth is local. We're interpreting contracts. There are many counterparties, but we interpret them internally. So of course, we're getting into dispute with our counterparties because we don't see what they see. We don't have the same facts as them. And of course, that impedance is driving a serious amount of friction between the counterparties. So we have a lot of administrative churn and rework that's being driven by this. And the IT responses have actually exacerbated the problem by creating multiple versions of truths. So again, we have these contract disputes that are born from the fact that we interpret them locally inside of our own company, that drives an intense amount of administrative rework, so an intense amount of work that is being done in each of these companies on the same contracts. It should be a similar set of facts, but what we're seeing is interpretations into different schemas. So that's driving a lot of delay, it's driving a lot of rework, and it's driving G&A, or general administrative cost burdens. So essentially what we need is some way to actually have shared facts in between the counterparties and shared interpretations of contracts. So interestingly, they start to move to blockchain, and I highlighted the AI for a reason here because we're starting to see now the advent, and it's been referenced a couple times, including in Mike Hearn's address yesterday, that we're seeing that the automation of smart contracts is starting to overlay and be a convergence of these other technologies. So key for why blockchain in the oil and gas setting and why the oil and gas companies are moving towards it is the shared fact. The what you see is what I see kind of component of how we can actually understand that we have the same interpretation of a contract and we're sharing the same data. I mean the exact same data. So of course that gives us a lot of transparency inside the contract models and across the counterparties, drives a higher level, and of course when you start talking about sharing your data with your counterparties, you're really talking about privacy and security and how do we trust our partners enough that we can share data with them when we don't really trust that they're maybe giving us the right data if they're the operator and we're the royalty aggregate. So of course smart contract automation starts to emerge as the interesting hub of all of that. So why Corda? Inside of that why blockchain, now nobody's made a better case for Corda lately than Richard Gendel-Brown with his top 10 facts. If you haven't read that, it's out in medium.com. It's on most of the social media channels. And I talked to Richard before the show and asked him if I could use this because I think his top 10 facts really resonated. Now, there's a couple out of there that are future models, like the enterprise tokens, some of the interoperability that we see in between platforms we haven't experienced yet. But from our perspective, those top 10 were very important for us, but also there were 4 key reasons that we moved forward with Corda on top of the other platforms. One was the JVM base. So we're Java coders. We're a Java shop from Calgary, Alberta. We've been doing Java for 20 years. James Gosling, the father of Java, is from Calgary. Interestingly, he told me 2 months ago that he really liked the tech of blockchain, but that it was wrapped in a Ponzi scheme. So that was a very interesting comment from the father of Java, and I think that shows where, as a market, we're starting to open up to the fact that there's a reality coming from underneath all of that Ponzi scheme, and that's driven by real applications and a lot by Corda. Second biggest reason was it was permissioned. There's absolutely no way we can share the data that we have with everybody. Why would we move it across the network? Why would we do the compute? Why would we put our compute resources into having all the data everywhere when we're really focused on the counterparties having the right data and maybe a regulator being able to monitor that data or interact with that data? The regulator doesn't need all of our data. So you have all these step downs where everybody doesn't need everything. And that's not the type of validation, of course, that we can complete in Corda, where we do a node to node, where as long as the counterparties agree, we can establish that as a fact and move forward. The other thing is the ecosystem, and I put AWS there because we sort of stumbled in our relationship with R3 into AWS in that we started setting up our nodes on our network, and we found that AWS was a really willing partner to do some work. So us R3 and AWS did an amazing thing in February, which we did the first blockchain platform, or payments on a blockchain platform for oil and gas royalties. And so number 4, and the ecosystem is us, it's all the people who were yesterday, and it's growing so rapidly inside the Corda sphere that it's really startling. And I've never seen anything quite like the adoption of real things that's coming on the heels of the POCs and pilots and everything that we saw last year and before. And the 4th reason has been the partnership with R3. It's been amazing from the top down how we've been able to really get excellent support on a technology that has worked for us from the very beginning. So we talked about that Java base and why we went there, and the interesting thing was, as soon as we started transacting, I was actually coincidentally with Todd McDonald and Ricardo when the first payment went through. Total coincidence that it happened. It showed up on my phone. Mike G had run it for our big companies, and I was with R3 leadership. From that point forward, it's been the smoothest ride I have ever seen in terms of a company and a platform and an ecosystem supporting us. So those were the real 4 big reasons why we moved to Corda. So I talked about it a bit. This is when we did the first payment. This is when, in February of this year, we actually transacted the first PNG royalty on blockchain in the world. We believe, nobody else has encountered our claim. And it was between these counterparties, and it really proved that blockchain is a team sport. Whether you're on the other platforms or on Corda, this is all about interoperability, compatibility. It's all about shared resources. It's all about you see what I see. It's all very team-based. So we were happy to have this team at the table with us. And ATB actually did the financial rail. So they are an R3 bank, one of the R3 consortia. And we really worked with all of these people to make a bit of history. And just a bit on Prairie Sky there. So at the center of our network now, we have Prairie Sky Royalty, which is the largest royalty aggregate in the world. They're running about 16.4 million acres. They have about 300,000 contracts that we are currently consensualizing with the counterparties. And those counterparties include some of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, like ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell. So right now we have this royalty aggregate in the middle of our network that can propose or consensualize the terms of the contract. We've been working at Prairie Sky for years, and we've been doing a lot of work understanding their contracts, stripping the facts out of their contracts, getting their contracts in a state that we can actually propose contract terms with it. And all of those counterparties now, we're in a state where we're starting to build a network out with our partners of all these counterparties. So from a network perspective, that means we can drive a really interesting value proposition with the ledger, which is you see what I see, we have the same set of facts, we agree on the asset representation, we agree on the facts that we're ingesting to do our calculations, we agree on the calculation. So we have consensualized this model, and as we move it into the industry, it's been astounding that these large companies are, because they're looking for that rework lift, that G&A reduction, that cost reduction, they're actually embracing it quite rapidly. So we have already seen from the POCs and pilots that we've run that we have a very strong value statement that we've been able to deliver into the industry. So the royalty ledger, as I said, was formed. It was in February of this year, and ever since now we've been consensualizing contracts and working on the contract ingest and working on different types of contracts and different types of smart contract representations that reflect that. And an interesting thing that we've learned is, of course, in the mindset of the customer, a contract is a paper vehicle that has X amount of pages and X amount of clauses. In the smart contract world, we only really want to deal with a couple of those clauses. So a paper contract might turn into 10, 20, 50 smart contracts. So we take particular functions out of those paper contracts and paper corpora, and we execute them on the ledger. We had so this is what happened since the payment, and this is where GuildOne has sort of really flourished. Now we've been able to do, since we did the first royalty payment with R3 and Amazon, we've now had a series of events that keep leading us further and further and led us to this moment and beyond, which is the adoption rate is astounding. I mean, I referenced it before, but we have not seen a technology, and you know, we're the oldest blockchain team from where I'm from Calgary, but we haven't seen the type of adoption. We've been able to get other really interested luminary people to our board, like Eric Grimson, the MIT Chancellor. We've announced the EBX, which is the Energy Block Exchange, how we're going to consensualize these contracts. And we've now just been finalized for Entrepreneur of the Year, and we're starting to win Science and Technology Awards. And a lot of that is our work with R3 and Corda. We've built them on top of there. We've used those models and algorithms I referenced earlier, and now we have ways to get on-ramps and off-ramps into the ledger. We've also been referenced as the top oil and gas blockchain in Gartner Research, a blockchain company, Blockchain Solutions. And the Hype Cycle for Oil and Gas 2018 now includes blockchain, and they referenced us directly. Our job now is to make sure that the R3 and Corda community can grow out in that ecosystem like it is in financial tech. So we're out there all the day banging the drums on Corda, bringing it forward, and we wholeheartedly want to introduce a community of Corda developers into oil and gas. Of course, we're now the feature solution worldwide on Amazon blockchain for energy. And I referenced the the R3 marketplace earlier. I think that's just launched, so we're happy to be part of that. Interestingly, if you saw Mike Hearn's presentation last night, this interface and the one that we're demoing for a couple of private demos, and please reach out to me, we have our stuff here, all built in JavaFX actually, so with Scene Builder and all of that stuff. So Mike, your stuff resonated with us yesterday. And we're looking for ways that we can actually simplify our delivery of those. So Graviton makes a lot of sense to us as well, although we'll have to do probably a little bit of Maven because we're Gradle guys. So we can leg wrestle on that one later. Interestingly, high-speed settlement is one of the biggest benefits we're getting. We're doing what traditionally was taking 90 days in now 90 seconds. And that 90 seconds interjects some pauses. We're actually pausing so that the counterparties can actually see and redeem. We don't have to do that. We could execute them through as they build trust, as we run our EBXA network, as we build trust with the counterparties, we'll be settling them instantly. Right now, there's a bit of pause baked in so people will know. We're dramatically reducing the cash cycle time. So we didn't think the operators would move that fast with us. We thought we knew the royalty companies and the holders would be very interested. But what we're seeing is the operators being very interested because they're able to minimize their cash cycle time on their accounts receivable, accounts payable. They're able to actually execute a faster version of their transactions. There's fewer intermediaries in the mix. We're getting increased efficiency, or dramatic reduction in the amount of people working on the admin side of these transactions, and we're avoiding all of these contract disputes. We talked about disputes earlier in the talk, but they're driving massive changes and driving a lot of value towards the lawyers. So we're mitigating all of that, and by making them consensualized before they transact, we actually disable that entire dispute. As a personal note, I am an expert witness on resource claims in the federal courts right now. I'm in about $4 billion worth of claims against the government of Canada on behalf of the First Nations. And the interesting thing that you see developing there is that a DLT solution, a Corda-based solution would have allowed us to mitigate all of that by giving that transparency through to the stakeholders. I'm not advocating that every private freeholder has a Corda node. That's not really happening now. Maybe that'll happen in the future. But what we see is aggregates of those. So that same corporate aggregation that we see amongst companies and corporations aggregating their royalty interests and operating them, starting to see that from private freeholders and farmers. So people who own mineral rights but have no tool set. So there's this democratization that's happening as well. And that concept that we can avoid those disputes is critical. So of course we talk, what's a railway? We think about this as a high-speed railway now. And what's a railway without a platform? So our platform is Corda. We're working a lot with AWS on how we can scale it, how we can actually build a network of Corda nodes, and that's maturing at such a rate. We had to stand up our own Corda nodes. We had to on AWS. We did all that independently because we were in research mode. But now the selection that you have, when you log on to AWS and you have Corda, you can stand up a node in minutes now, and you can start actually building a Corda. We built all of our own stuff. We pioneered some stuff, but now we're happy to see that the tools are maturing. And there's a maturity not only to the delivery mechanisms, but the building mechanisms and the developments. So that's been a really, probably the most important vector that we've seen over the last 3 to 6 months, is that the tool sets are really maturing quickly now. So that's all about platform. Where we're at now is we're building out a network now amongst the largest royalty aggregates in the world. And of course, I talked a bit about private freeholders and First Nations, but of course the R3 banks and how we're going to settle these are really critical right now. We're getting to a state now where we're looking to accelerate the payment rail side of this. So we're working with the R3 team in Canada actually, and a lot of the Canadian banks on trying to execute that. Now, we've launched in Houston last year, but what's increasingly happened now is the US royalty holders are coming to us. So the interesting thing that we see is they all want to be led. They all want to be held firmly by the hand through all of this. And the interesting thing I think that we can provide for them as an ecosystem is that if the people inside the organizations who've been arguing for blockchain now have real case studies to reference. They now have real things to talk about and real networks that are forming. So this is, of course, driving a lot of interest from the regulators who are really interested in seeing the operator reported volumes. They're interested in seeing those things on the ledger, but they don't necessarily want to run a big network themselves. They would love to capitalize on industry work. So in our demos, you will see that the regulators actually can monitor all the operator-reported volumes without actually seeing the financial transactions. Our regulators in oil and gas are a little bit different than the regulators in fintech. But this mechanism gives them the ability to monitor the things that they're monitoring and share the facts off the ledger that are important from a compliance perspective. So that ecosystem is really growing rapidly. And this is a little bit of our future, and this is the very interesting thing that I think starts to butt up against like Corda enterprise tokens and this concept of actually native asset value. And I'm going to leave you with the thought that what we're working on now with some providers in Canada is the ability to measure from the field the hydrocarbon value, so the data points that actually are the measurement points along the flow regime. And we're working on a project that will ledgerize that measurement, and then smart contracts will actually do the production accounting functions. So smart contracts will actually consume the measurement from the field and write the PA, or production accounting functions, and of course inject those values into our royalty ledgers. And that's critical, and that project's fired up, and we're announcing it in Houston. I guess I just kind of announced it right now, so a little bit ahead of it. So to sum up, we're on this concept of revenue completeness, which SAP, Accenture, all of the big firms said wasn't possible in oil and gas, and that up to 15% of the contracts were never fully executed. This mechanism that we have, this ability that we now have through DLTs and smart contracts, is allowing us to talk about how we can align those interests, make sure we're sharing the same data, create high-speed settlement against that, so no lag times, no big tails of dispute, no long AP and AR, accounts payable and receivable functions, to have this concept of revenue completeness. So I think we've got some time for questions.
How does what you're doing differ from or compete with wax plan model for oil contract? Is the person who's in a room who raised this question want to give a little bit of background to that? I can say very briefly that if you want to just give...
Yeah, on whether they have or are building a effective peer-to-peer DLT based, I believe, on Ethereum for provisioning for the oil business. And I wonder if are you competing with them on it, or what has it?
Well, I guess I can talk about the competition there in a couple of flavors. One would be the Ethereum build. We looked at Ethereum fairly, we scrutinized it. We decided against it for a variety of reasons, and I would hold to those reasons, and I would think if it's an Ethereum-based competitor, we have some baked-in advantage over them by adopting Corda. So I think the first answer to the question is I'm not aware of that project. There are other ones bubbling up. There's some people trying to do native asset tokenization. Ethereum is a good flavor for that. There's EOS, the energy operating system. There's some work in IOTA Foundation that I recently attended in New York. From an interesting perspective, I don't think any of those solve the problem like Corda solves it. And then it goes back again to the permission state, the private ledgering, the ability to actually only have our counterparties sharing the ledger. The compute and the resources required to spread the data everywhere, even places where they don't need it or shouldn't have it, I think is key. Our chief operating officer, his brother runs an oil and gas company, and he was in the boardroom with him saying, hey, can you imagine all your data is stored on your counterpart or your rivals, your competitors' systems? It's encrypted. Don't worry about it. It's all good. It's encrypted. You know, he showed his own brother the door. So I think the first thing is if we truly are competing with that, they've done a poor choice of platform selection for our business problem.
So I think it was actually called force field before.
Oh, I know force field. I know force field very well.
So it's force field that was renamed to that.
Okay, I know force field. One of the reasons we had with force field that we didn't really like was they really wanted a persistent license of all of our IP. So we kind of had to back out for a couple of reasons. If they've gone forward on Ethereum, that's news to me because we had to shred our NDAs with that consortia. I know we're seeing them next week in Houston, so we'll get the updates on that. But again, if they've gone with Ethereum, they're not solving the problem correctly from our estimation.
Awesome, I love it. Get more of that. I feel like I can hear a lot of Mike and James and Richard in you too. Another question up here. What's the latest Corda version you've developed in Azure VMs?
We have not built in Azure VMs.
Okay. Did you create your own standards or leverage existing ones?
So interesting thing on standards, in Alberta, although we're called dirty oil, we're actually the most finely grained regulator on the planet. We spend the most money on environmental standards, on human rights standards, and actually Canadian oil is the cleanest and most ethical oil that you can. Inside of Alberta, we spend about $70 million a year on our regulator, and inside of our regulator, we have a standard called Directive 17. Directive 17 is measurement, and that measurement standard is the most finest defined regulative standard on measurement that exists on the planet. Inside of our tool set that we're working for, in fact, we think we just renamed a smart contract D17, because we think that actually smart contracts and ledgers are a great way to share regulator componentry that won't go. The United States won't adopt Alberta regulations. There's a lot of reasons why they should from an environmental standards perspective, but they'll never go there because they're very libertarian about regulation, and they don't tread on me as a real thing. But if it's encoded in running systems that have these dramatic benefit statements to them, that's the way that we get those good global standards moving. Directive 17 is being picked up worldwide right now, and our intent is to have the entire measurement regime as reflected as a D17 compliance standard inside of a DLT environment in Corda.
Great. So we are running almost out of time. Just having a last question here, and this is a very Corda-related question. I thought it would be relevant for you to cover that, just so we make sure everybody understands what Corda is in this room. There's a question around, do you see all the data that the members see?
Does the business network operator see it?
I believe when it says do you, it must be you as GuildOne, so the business network operator.
So currently we're performing a lot of functions on the network because the companies aren't ready. They're not ready to take on the notary functions. They're not ready to take on all the validation. They're not ready to take on all of those functions that we see being more distributed. We have our own doorman because when we set up, there wasn't a really consumable one inside of the Corda world. So there are features. The short answer to the question is yes. We see in the middle of the network all of the data that is flowing. But as these functions mature, become more robust, and the sort of compliance and operating models emerge, we will see maybe less of the transactional data. As the business network operator, we can inject code, we can see the flow of data.
Thank you so much, James,
Thank you
for having this presentation.
Awesome. Thank you very much.